Hi guys, it's Miss Madison here, and today we're going to be learning how to write a rhetorical analysis. So I'm going to walk you guys through how I would write a rhetorical analysis essay so you can kind of get an idea of how that process works. So let's get started. So today we're going to be looking at the same speech that we looked at in terms of how to read for a rhetorical analysis. So this is when JFK was calling out the US steel industry for raising their prices during a recession. And as we look at this piece, I wanted to kind of think about a couple of things. So as you start to get started, you want to think about your thesis. And we know that he's upset with the steel industry. So normally I would talk about like an exhortation about how he's like kind of calling us to action. A lot of times that's what speeches do. They call their audience to a certain, action. But for this purpose, I would consider it more of a diatribe. So at first I called it an exhortation, and then I changed it to it's more of a diatribe, which is like a vicious sort of attack against the steel industry. So that's kind of identifying like his mode or purpose there. He's having this attack and condemning their behavior in the eyes of the American public. So he wants the American public to condemn them, and he also wants them to hear that condemnation and change their actions. So JFK's diatribe against the U.S. steel industry, as they raise their prices, right? While we have to think about the context too, like while the average American, struggled to make ends meet. So that kind of gets into sort of the purpose, like what he's trying to accomplish. It's a condemnation. And now we want to think about his strategies. So that's the purpose. And then let's think about what kinds of things is he using as he's doing this. So now I'm just going to go back and take a look at the actual speech. So we know that he starts off with his really strong thesis, just like condemning them right up front, calling it wholly unjustifiable and irresponsible defiance of the public interest. So that's definitely part of his strategy, right? He takes it like right from the start. So I might be talking about that in my essay. Other things I kind of noticed with this, he calls it like this serious hour in our nation's history. So his word choice might be something I look at. It's kind of a grave or more, intense kind of word choice. So I might point that out in my strategies. But really, as we start to look at the overall strategies of the whole sort of passage, we can see that he's really bringing up multiple examples, right? He says, we are confronted with this Berlin and Southeast Asia stuff. We are devoting our energies to economic recovery when we are asking reservists to leave their homes and families. So you start to see like example, when we're doing this, when we're doing this, when we're doing this. Do you guys see how like those examples really like add up and like make it more powerful? So I'd probably talk about that, like how he has like multiple examples or extended examples that he's using repetition to sort of punctuate with. So that's definitely part of his strategy. Like this, when we're going through this and this and this, it's kind of hard to argue when you have that many examples. So that would probably be one of the strategies I would talk about. He definitely likes to highlight it with a parallel structure, right? That repetition, when we are, when we are, when we are, and that those examples kind of compound. So if I was going to write this, I would talk about how his use of extended examples compound over and over to, sort of highlight his condemnation. I might also talk about how he uses parallel structures. So like repetition, you could say like repeated. If you want to say repeated is another way to say that. Repeated over and over. You could say his use of extended examples through parallel structure is another way to talk about that. Like that structure is paralleled over and over, compound over and over to highlight his condemnation. I think that's definitely one of the strategies that he uses really well. You could also talk about his inflammatory or condemnatory, I guess, is that a word? Condemnatory. Diction is a fancy word for word choice. His inflammatory or condemnatory diction sort of punctuates his criticism of the steel industry. So something like that would probably come up a little bit. So those are the big ones that I would want to talk about if I was going to be writing about this essay. And so now we want to combine those into a thesis. So we've got his purpose, he wants to condemn them, and we've got the basic strategies. So one way we could do this is kind of leading in with the context, right? So like what was going on at the time. So like while, the American, while the country was sort of battling to, both abroad, like because he talks about how we were battling in Germany and also I think in Vietnam, obviously at the time, and also at home during an economic recession. So like while this is going on, that kind of gives you that kind of context. And if you want with your intro, you might lead in with some of that context, like what was going on at the time, who was the audience, who was the speaker, it's JFK, what is he talking about? So your intro would probably have some of that. I'm just trying to get the thesis kind of solidified right now. During this, while we were going through this in, what was it, like 1962, I think. Let's see, so while this was going on, we could just talk about how JFK's, or we want to bring up the fact that the steel industry did this, right? Like while the country was doing this, the U.S. steel industry had, raised their prices, damaging the American people, really, like damaging the country. Damaging the American, we could say maybe way of life here. So because we have the while up here, this is a dependent sentence. So while the country was going through this, the steel industry raised their prices, damaging the American way of life. So now we have to put a semicolon here because we're about to like put another sentence, right? So this is all one sentence. The while is dependent, but then this is the actual sentence. The U.S. steel industry raised their prices. So then we can get into JFK's bids, right? So like JFK, condemns. And we actually would probably start with the strategies. So I would be like JFK's what do we want to talk about? His harsh, inflammatory. I'm going to use that word. I hope it's a word. Yeah, I think it is. JFK's harsh, inflammatory diction, coupled with his use of extended examples through parallel structure. And notice how I'm using these kind of, prepositional phrases, right? Through this, in this, because of that. Those kind of relational words help connect. And that's kind of how you can make all these things kind of come together. So JFK's harsh, inflammatory, I guess, oh, there it is. Okay. Diction coupled with his use of extended examples through parallel structure. These things make the pursuit, and we could say their pursuit because we've already kind of connected this to the steel industry in the previous sentence, their pursuit of profit. I think he calls it their pursuit of profit. So it's kind of nice to put that in quote marks here, showing like, yeah, you get like that's like really a line that stands out. Their pursuit of profit even more despicable, right? Like that's part of what he's doing here with his language is it's like already kind of despisable, but he's like making it even more despicable. In the eyes, and this is all for like on some level for the American public to condemn them and then therefore put that pressure on the steel industry. So in the eyes of the American people or public. Okay, good. Let's see if that reads right. So the country battled abroad in Germany and Vietnam and also at home during the economic recession. The U.S. steel industry raised their prices, damaging the American way of life. So it gives that kind of a little bit of background there. JFK's harsh, inflammatory diction coupled with his use of extended examples through parallel structure. And I realize that's kind of a long process, but I want to talk about multiple things in my essay, so I kind of have to squeeze it in there for my thesis. You guys could have multiple parts for your thesis and multiple sentences if you want. Just combine them with a semicolon to make sure it's like, oh yeah, this is my whole thesis. Anyway, so I kind of throw it all in there in one sentence. Make their pursuit of profit even more despicable in the eyes of the American public or people. I'm going to put people here. It just sounds better to me. Okay. So we have two parts, right? We have the strategies and we also have his purpose. Do you guys see how whatever you're analyzing, you want to figure out like what are they trying to accomplish and then like what are their strategies? So now we have our thesis. This will help us kind of focus the essay as we go. The next thing we would want to do is figure out what to talk about for our body paragraphs. So I always recommend doing like a chronological order. So I would talk about like how he starts off and how that like sets us up for a certain thing. And then I would lead into like the next paragraph and how he's like really like leading us through to make his point. So like the choices he's making at this point, he wants to probably, you know, connect with the American people, but also call them out. So let's see what he does. We know he starts off with a direct sort of condemnation of their behavior. He calls it a wholly unjustifiable and irresponsible defiance of the public interest. So he's not like mincing words here. So I might even say that, like I might put something like JFK doesn't mince words. He just gets right to it. You know, doesn't mince words as he starts off. And we could call it his I think, yeah, diatribe is probably the right word here. So as he starts his diatribe, you know, against the steel industry. So, against the steel industry. And then we could put something like, you know, by calling their actions, and he calls them what, like wholly unjustifiable and irresponsible. He calls it a wholly unjustifiable and irresponsible defiance of the public interest. Oh, wow. Okay, good. So here we've got our quote. And we can even kind of connect this quote to an appositive phrase here. So I can put a comma there with the quote marks and then just, you know, call that something else. Like this is definitely like a clear indictment up front. You know, a clear condemnation or clear like criticism and clear indictment up front. And so from there you would want to talk about like how does that work, right? So that functions really well for his speech because like calling them out up front like this in this way allows the American people to see his point clearly and kind of know where he's headed, right? And so what they would expect next is like explanation of it, and kind of readies them to hear why. Okay, good. So do you guys see how we're talking about like how he's making these choices and then how that's good for his purpose and like how that functions for his goal, right? So just starting off that way is, it's good for his argument. Up next, we can see what he does. He actually continues. He says, in this serious hour of this nation's history, when we are confronted in this crisis in Berlin, we are devastated to our energies, when we are asking the reservists. So this is when I would be talking about that, like when we are, right? Like, so that's when I would bring up like JFK further aligns himself, right? So when he's saying we, I would talk about that, like his use of this first person plural we really puts him in with the American people. So he like further aligns himself with the American people, you know, saying, and it's not even like he's just saying it, right? Because he repeats it. So we want to point that out, like repeating when we are, what does he say? Like, let's look at it. When we are devoting our energies, when we are confronted, when we are devoting our energies, and then we could put like when we are confronted. Okay, good. And I might even break this up into two quotes here, just because they are technically starting at different places, so it just kind of reads maybe a little more clearly. JFK further aligns himself with the American people, repeating when we are devoting our energies and when we are confronted. This, and then we don't need a period there, my bad. this rhetorical choice, and I try to avoid this. I know we all do it, like we're all like, this means, or like this rhetorical choice. So I always try and stop myself from saying this because it's kind of vague and the reader wants to get more direct. So I try and talk about what I want to say like in that moment. So aligning himself with we, when he says we are, dot, dot, dot. He is putting himself in the same plane as the American people. And then we would just want to talk about like how does that affect his goal? Like why is he doing this? So when he does this, he's putting himself in the same plane as the American people, further sort of emphasizing that we are in this together and the steel industry has wronged us all, right? So it's this huge team of like the whole country against the steel industry. Pretty powerful rhetorical move to say like this is us and that's them. So this rhetorical strategy, so this rhetorical move to other, I need a verb here, like to sort of divide the country, or divide the, divide the country is fine. Divide the story, or divide the actors, divide the situation. I don't know. Hold on. Really struggling here. Sorry guys. Okay. This rhetorical move to divide the people involved into us versus them, us versus the steel industry. It paints a strong picture of the true villain, right? Like, we are all harmed. We all are all harmed by their actions. Okay, good. So I hope this makes sense. You would want to start off with this really strong thesis with your purpose and your strategies, and then you would want to lead in with like how do they start, and talking about like what does that do for them, and then like what's the next strategy you see going on. So to continue this, I would just continue to look at the next paragraph and see if that's worth talking about, or if I want to move to the next one after that. You want to try and pick things that are the most meaningful. You can't talk about every single word. So you want to pick out the stuff that really is meaningful and sticks out to you as being rhetorically successful, and like what works for you. I might, for example, talk about how it can show such utter contempt for the interest of 185 million Americans. I think that's a pretty strong line. And the way that I would maybe, talk more about how like it's us versus them, and it's individually 185 million of us who have been individually affected with the way that he puts this. So his choice to call us out as like 185 million of us, it's quite a bit more now. So it's kind of interesting. Our population's increased that much. And then also I would talk about like the utter contempt, right? Like how this is their behavior toward us is just showing utter contempt for us. Like we should be enraged. We should be outraged by what they did because they're showing contempt for our interests personally. So I would talk about that probably to kind of finish up this paragraph, and then I would keep going. I don't want to write a whole essay because it's going to take like 45 minutes and I don't want to like bore you guys, but I just wanted to give you guys a couple of things in terms of, hey, this is how I would start off, and this is the kind of work you're doing for your own pieces. So do you guys see how you're working through kind of a chronological order of like, this is how they started, this is how it is continuing, and then I would have a last body paragraph talking about like how he closes at the end. So, and he does have kind of a crazy close at the end. It's something where he's like, in the last 24 hours, we had their answer. It's pretty powerful. I would definitely analyze that. So yeah, so that's rhetorical analysis in kind of a quick nutshell. And let me know if you guys have questions. I'm here for you as you go through this, and have fun with it. Okay, bye guys.